Um, let us do a bit of review about React and components, functional and class, and then we'll jump into our component lifecycle tonight. Let me share my screen. Okay. I don't know if Ryan showed you Code Sandbox or if I have in the past. Give me a thumbs up on that thumbs up here if you've seen Code Sandbox before. I'm not sure if I've showed it to you or if Ryan did. Right on that. Okay. I'm going to say that there's, all right, 10 people, 10 students. We've seen Code Sandbox before. I could very well go and use Create React App, create a new app, show it to you. I like using Code Sandbox just for the lectures because we can see it happen pretty much in real time. Occasionally there's a couple of hiccups, but for the most part it works really well in real time. So we're going to see just our regular old, well, actually this is not a regular, this is a class component here. And so who can tell me when would we use a class component over a functional component? There are two different times, and we're going to talk about one of those times in depth tonight. When dealing with state, 100%, right? Because if we have a functional component, if we say function, new component, we can't, I mean, we could do something. No, we can't actually. Sorry. We can't do anything like this. We can't hold state in a function component, right? So if we don't need state and we don't need the lifecycle methods, which we're going to talk about tonight, we can use a functional component. And like I said in the past, I always start out, unless I know for a fact that that component needs state, I always start out as a functional component. And I'll work on it until it actually needs some state in there. So our functional component is what we would call a presentational component, where it's really just going to hold some UI, right? And it's going to take in some props. We're going to be able to manipulate that UI by giving it some props, and it's going to give us back some JSX. So functional components are really fast. They're really easy to create, but they don't have a whole lot of functionality, which is kind of oxymoronic, right? So when we create a class component, like this app is created right now, we can now create state. And we can now use this component to create state, right? And hold some data about this component in there. So if I say name, I say Dan, right? And then we can come in here and use, let's go, this.state.name. We'll see it appear on the screen, probably. Oh, come on. Do I have to save it? There we go. We can use this to update and create our state and hold data about this component. So we always say that React is a view library, right? Any of you that are out there that have worked in any kind of web development in the past know these acronyms MVC or MVVC or MVVM. There's a lot of these kind of these frameworks built around what we call a model view controller, where React is only the view. We're only going to get the presentational part of React or of the page from React. And what we're doing here is we're actually returning that UI, right? We have some state. We can control it by maybe putting a click handler on here or something and changing the state, an input box, right? But this is what we're doing here. So let's actually break down what this component is doing and why we're using all of these, constructor and render, and you'll see a few more built-in methods that we're going to talk about tonight. So when we create this class of app, we are essentially creating a regular old JavaScript class, right? We're extending some functionality, but if we just had, this is going to break our React app, but if we just had this, there's nothing React about this, right? We'll hide that for a moment. This is just a component, right? So let's actually, I want to move into just creating a regular old component right now called my component. And this is just JavaScript. There's no React in this at all. I kind of wanted to show you how a component works and why we use certain things. So in this component, I'm going to use our constructor. And what does our constructor do when we create a new class? Anyone remember? It's just regular JavaScript, right? From a few weeks ago. Yeah, we can use it to bind this, for sure. Well, let's think about what it does. It actually sets up and creates the class for us, right? So when we go and say something like, let comp equal new my component, when we use this, when we say new is going to call the constructor, right? And it's going to do whatever we want in here. So we can say this dot anything equals true. We can set the what we want in here, and actually, yeah, that's fine. We can still do that. And I'll console log comp. Yes, it is. Let's get rid of that for a second. And let's get rid of this for a second. And look, we have a new class, and the constructor essentially set our properties on it, right? This is doing the same exact thing in React for us when we have our constructor. So we are setting a property on this class called state, and I'm going to just okay. So that essentially, when we do something along the lines of this in React, remember, is using JSX to, under the hood, do this, okay, and do some fancy React stuff with it. So when we do that, we are creating a new instance of this class. When we create something like a JSX tag like this in React, we're creating a new instance of that class. Okay, so that's why that's doing that. So I kind of wanted to show you a little bit of how React works behind the scenes, so we know why we do something like props and super to props, right? Let's just put that in because we talked about that last with our components, and I'm going to get rid of that. So I'm going to pretend to I'm going to recreate a React component. And I'm actually going to put it up here because it will not hoist. So I'm going to create a class of component. This is going to be our parent class. And what we're going to do in here is it's going to take some props, and it's going to create a new property on this component, or excuse me, this class called this.props. All right, this is our parent class. If we remember from ES6, pretty simple here. All we're doing is creating something on here that equals props. So when we come down here and create a new component and extends component, what are we doing when we run this constructor and when we run super? What is super doing for us? If you remember back to our ES6 class lessons. By using extends and the super method, we have it inheriting, yep. Run the parent constructor, I see a little bit more typing, so I'm going to wait for others. Let's just use the methods of the parent or on the parent. And I'll wait for one more second. Binds this. Okay, cool. Yeah, exactly. That's all true, right? When we use super with extends, what we're doing is we're running the constructor of the component, right? We're passing it some stuff, in this case, props, and it's giving us back a template to go off of, right? And in this case, all we're doing is it's going to give us a key on there called props, and it's going to set it to the props we gave it. So let's do this. I'm going to say I want to give it some props, name Dan. Run it, and look, we now have a key on my component with the props and an object with a name key and Dan, okay? So when we create a React component, in our constructor, we're gonna run super, and in this case, app isn't, we don't really need to run super for the props in here, but let's just say class name comp extends one moment. Oop, did not include that open curly. There we go. So when we do something like this, what we're doing is we're creating a this dot props. Notice nowhere in our constructor are we creating this dot props. Okay, so if I say name comp, that's essentially what's happening in our last page. Oh yeah, we need a render, and I'll tell you why in just a moment. Cool. And we can change this to whatever we want, right? It's receiving those props. If I can spell my own name. And what this is doing is this is creating that this dot props. Notice nowhere on here are we creating this dot props. The same goes for this render method, right? You're like, we need a render method on this component in order to do anything. If we don't have this render method, if we look here, it's going to break, right? We need a render method on it because React is expecting, now that this is a component, that it has a method called render on it, okay? So just to show you in this case, what that's going to look like is, let's just say down here, React is actually running. We don't see any of this stuff. It's going to say, and we should give that an upper C. It's going to say this. React's like, okay, I created this new component, and I'm going to call render on it. And then we're going to say, oh, there's no, oh, that's not the right one. We're going to say render is not a function, right? React is actually going to say, we need a function called render. Oh, we don't have it in there yet. Because it's going to expect there to be a render function on it. So what we need to do is get it a render function that renders some UI. We're going to return, we're just going to say some UI to the screen because we're not doing the full React thing here. And it's like, cool, all right, there we go. It's going to render some UI to the screen now. And so this is called our mounting part of our life cycle. This is the mounting phase of our life cycle. We are going to give it a constructor, and we're going to give it a render method. And so this is how React is working under the hood, right? Essentially, there's a lot more to it than this for right now, but this is how React's working. It's going to say like, okay, this is our React component class. We're going to extend that React component, and we're going to expect it to at least have a render method in it, because React is going to call it. So when we create these components, we need to, at bare minimum, give it a render method, right? Because React is always going to call that render method. So I want to introduce us to what's known as the component lifecycle right now. Oop, that was not the one I was looking for. There we go. So when a component is created on our DOM, it goes through a certain life cycle. It goes through 3 phases. It goes through a mounting phase, it goes through an updating phase, and it goes through an unmounting phase. Okay, the mounting phase, the first thing that happens is our constructor is called on the mounting phase. So the constructor is the same constructor we've always known, right? We've created ES6 classes before. It's the same exact constructor. It works in the same exact way. We saw that in this little demo here. It works in the same exact way, right, as a regular constructor works. The constructor in React is used to hold the initial state of our data. That is why we come in here and we say, something like this.state. It allows us to create state of this component. It is going to set the component up with the data it needs before it's mounted. So we need this data before it gets mounted to the DOM. And so when I say mounted to the DOM, remember we have that div with that ID of root. React is going to take this component and mount it to the actual DOM. It's going to created on the DOM for us. So we can create this state, this data that we need to actually do that. The constructor is fantastic for receiving props. And we can actually use the constructor to say something like, this is not a real good way of doing this, but we can do something like this, right? We can actually use the constructor to receive props. We can ascertain certain things about the props we're getting. We can set our state based on the props we've gotten. The constructor is fantastic for doing it. This is, remember, the first thing that's called. As soon as I write this JSX, remember, this equals, oh man, I forgot how comments are difficult in React or in JSX. So this is essentially doing this, right? It's essentially creating a new instance of that class. So it calls that constructor. And in the past, we used it to bind methods to this. So Jonathan, right there, you were right on with that. In the past, we didn't have these arrow function methods, what are called class properties. And in fact, that's a very recent thing to be able to do that. We used to have to do something like this. Custom method, say this is just a custom method. We would have to create it like this, and then we'd have to come into our constructor and say, and this. We used to have to do this for every single piece of, every single method that we created our own on the component. So the constructor was great for that because we now created a bound method on there. Thankfully, we have class properties now, thanks to ES8, I believe, and we can use arrow functions that get away with this. So you're going to see this if you work in React in production. You might come across something that looks like this. Just know that we have replaced that with this, thankfully, in our future, or in the present now. It used to be a future thing. We used to have to do some special stuff to get it to work. So this is our first item on our mounting lifecycle method. This is the very first thing that's called as our constructor. IE8 doesn't support ES6 at all. Thankfully, we're running through something called Webpack and Babel on here, so we don't have to worry about that any longer. IE8 doesn't even support ES5. If you pass that method down to a child component, we'll need binding then. No, it's already bound to this component, so it doesn't need to be rebound. Yeah, that's what we used to do. Thankfully, with new Webpack and new Babel and Create React app, we don't have to do that any longer. But that's that's where you would do it, was in the constructor. Remember, the constructor is going to set our entire class, our instantiation, or our class instance up for use. It's going to set it up for us, and then it's going to say, okay, here you go. There's your instance of the class. Now use it as you will. Let's look at our little overview here. We're going to have something on here called get derived state from props. This is new, and it's kind of being phased out even as it's new, so we're not going to cover it. The next thing that gets called is render, right? And so like I showed you in here, React is just going to call render automatically. If there is no render, we do not have anything to view on the screen. So we have to have a render method. It's going to expect there to be a render. None of the other stuff it's going to expect there to be. It's not going to expect there to be any of these other ones. Okay, but render it needs, because render is going to do all the work for us. It is going to take all of our code and it's going to spit out some JSX or some code for us to display on the screen, right? Render is really the workhorse. It's constructor. It's going to set everything up, and render's the one chugging away. It's that train engine that's going to keep working for us. So essentially, render is the only method on here that is actually required. It is the lifeblood of every component. And when it's triggered, when React calls render, the UI returned is actually going to get rendered to the DOM. That's why it's called render, right? So that's the second part, the second thing that's called. Well, the third thing, but for our circumstances, it's going to be the second method that's called on the component lifecycle. So render is actually pretty unique because it's not only involved in the mounting, but it's also involved in the updating state as well, the phase of the life as well. So when we create that component, it's going to create it, then it's going to call render straight off the bat, and render is going to return some data, and that's going to be displayed on the page. So kind of wanted to work through this a little bit more. What's going to happen, our constructor is going to create props. It's also going to create a blank state object for us. So it's going to have default to state, and then it's going to create some other stuff for us on here. So when is the time that render actually gets called? Who can tell me when render gets called all the times? When it's mounted, when state changes, not necessarily when state changes. There's a very specific thing that needs to happen that will make render be called. If I did something like, let's just say method here, we're going to just fake method, that's what I'm going to call it. Set state, exactly. If I did something like this, and I said, oh my gosh. Brett, I'm going to use you, your first name I saw. Will render get called? That's a question for you all. No, it's not, because we haven't gone through the proper methods. So I'm going to show you more or less how the component does that. It's going to say something like this. And it's going to actually do, this is a little advanced. We're going to learn about what this is actually doing later, but it's creating a new object based on the state. And we're going to say change state. So it's going to create a new object based on the old state and the change state, and then it's actually going to say this.render. So set state does some stuff for us in the background, and then it recalls this.render again. Okay, so that's what's actually happening in the background. So let's actually come in here and, oops, not that one. We're going to come in here and we're going to do a couple of things real quick. We're going to console log in constructor. And then in render, we're going to console log render. Let's run it, and we'll see we get a very specific order. Constructor is called first, render is called second. Okay. So that's the mounting part of our life cycle phase. We call this the birth. We'll equate this to the life of a component. We have the birth of a component is the mounting. It's going to be the phase when the component is being built out from the ground up, whatever initial data we have. And finally, this, after everything is said and done, this method component did mount will be called. I'm going to wait for that for a moment. The second is our updating phase. So now that we have this component that's built and it appears on our screen, it's going to sit there and say, have you been updated yet? Have you been updated yet? That's where set state comes in, right? Set state is going to say, cool, I got some new data. Go ahead and update this now. So whenever set state is called, whenever our props change, it's going to be updated. So what's the first thing? Well, not the first thing. Get derived state from props is actually called first. Should component update. We're going to skip these two and go straight back to render. Render is the first thing that gets called for us in our case. So render is going to get called, and it's going to update. And it's going to keep updating for the entire life of this component, right? It's going to keep updating, and everything's going to happen through the life of this component. There's another method in here called component did update that's going to allow us to do some other things in between updating changes, and that's going to be our growth stage, right? It's our updating phase where you're growing, you're living your life, the component's living its life. Set state is used to change it. It re-renders, it re-renders, it re-renders, and finally, we're going to get to the unmounting phase. And the unmounting phase is like, okay, the component is no longer being used. We are going to remove it from the DOM. And so unmounting is going to call one lifecycle method called component will unmount. So component will unmount is essentially our death phase. We're going to remove the component from the screen. We're going to remove it completely from the DOM, and component will unmount is going to be called. And that's what it's going to do, is it's going to go in and it's going to clean up kind of all of the stuff that component was using, any memory allocation it was using. What can anyone think of any other reasons to use component did or component will unmount? Anything? It's pretty rare to use it, but it does have its uses. Cleaning up event listeners. Yep. So if you have set specific listeners based on window resizing or scroll bar position, etc., you don't want those just hanging out, because those are going to be connected to the DOM still. You don't want them just hanging out. You want to be able to go in and clean those up. any maybe database connection, or maybe like it had, we don't know about sockets yet, but sockets are like connections with another server, things like that. We want to close those off, free up the memory. Exactly. So I would say it's fairly rare to use component did will unmount, but just know that it is there. Let's go and talk about component did mount, which is the last part of our mounting phase right here. Okay. Not right there. So let's come in here and let's create a component did mount. Component did mount, and as well as all of our lifecycle methods, are written directly on our class right here. Just like render is, we're going to say component did mount. And we write it without that arrow syntax because it is already bound. React already knows to bind these to the class itself, okay? So component did mount is going to, let's go console log. And we're going to come in here and we'll say in our constructor. And so let's run it. We might have to just get there. So we have, and let's actually console log in here and not return anything. We're going to have in constructor right now and in render. Okay, we're waiting. And so the last thing React does is it says if comp.component did mount, then run it. So this is not necessary, as you may be well aware, because you haven't written it yet. It's not necessary. So React's going to say, if that's there, then run it. Okay. And so now we have this life cycle. We have the constructor runs first, render runs second, and once render's done doing all of its rendery things, and it's rendered your UI to the DOM, then component did mount is going to be called. Well, Arfita, we'll talk about that after the break tonight, but there's a very specific reason for component did mount. Okay, so this is the way it goes. Constructor happens, render happens, and once render's all done with everything, component did mount happens. So before we move on to why exactly we use component did mount, let me ask you all a question. If I were to go in and say I wanted to change the state, somewhere, could I do this? And we'll say name. Bernard, you got it, because you're first. Could I do this? Could I set state in render? This is an open question for you all. I want a yes or a no. Can I set state in render? And if you say no, I would like to know why. I see several people are still typing, so I'm going to wait for everyone. Say no, 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 loop, 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 loop. Okay, so let's go in it. So you're all right. You're all correct. It's an infinite loop. So what does set state do? Set state is going to change the state, and then it's going to call render again. Okay, and then when it calls render, it's going to say console log render, set state. Oh, set state. I'm going to set the state and call render again. So there this is, you cannot change the state from within render, because every time set state is called, and by proxy, every time the state is changed properly, render is recalled. Okay. So I wanted to point that out as to why we don't set state in render. So why we have component did mount is to set state. And I'll show you that after the break. Let's do 5 minutes and come back, and we'll keep going with our lifecycle methods. Oop. All right, everybody, come on back and we will keep going. Okay, so we have gone over our constructor, we've gone over render. How many times will render be called in the lifetime of our component? Anyone have any guesses? How many times render will be called in the lifetime of our component? I'll wait for a few more answers. Brett says as often as it is called. All right, yeah, you're all on the right track, right? It's at least going to be called one time, but it's going to be called as many times as it needs to, as many times as the state dictates that UI change needs to happen, right? So render is really based on, and I write this set state out. This is a very simplistic. This is actually not doing everything that it does, but this is pretty, just kind of get the concepts down. This is essentially what happens. It's actually going to look to see if there was anything re-rendered. It's going to look to see if anything actually was changed. It's going to do some stuff in there, but this is pretty straightforward of what it does. Okay, it's going to re-render it anytime. So we're going to get rid of that because I don't want to crash my whole computer. How many times is component did mount going to be called? Anyone have any guesses on that? Once. Anyone else think anything else? Any other times? Whenever component is mounted. Okay. Component did mount is for this component and for it being mounted. So I think Jonathan has a little bit more accurate answer, but it's only going to be called once in the life cycle of this component ever, right? So if I did a set state in here, is this going to cause an infinite loop? Is this going to do the same thing that render did? No, this is a fantastic place to set our state after things been rendered. Okay. So we use component did mount a lot of times to set our state. And I'll show you kind of a really semi-contrived example in here. Let's go const. I'm going to say names, and whoever just, you're all getting in here. RP to Jonathan. Let's do two more. Let's go. Jonathan, you were already in there. Rachel. Cool. We have a list of names here, right? Let's say that name is not name, but it's names. And we're going to call it, we're not going to give it a name in here. We're going to say this set state, we're going to say names is an empty array, okay? And then we can come in here to render and say, do a little conditional. We'll say names.length equals 0. This is ternary. If you haven't seen this, this is pretty common in React. We're going to say if names.length is 0, so that means I should say this.state. What am I thinking? We are going to give it a div that says, make it big, loading. We'll give it an H1. Non-semantic, I understand, but just for the sake of the big font. We're going to say loading, okay? Otherwise, we are going to say this.state names map give it a name. Let's do this. This makes it a little bit more clear what we're doing. Why am I getting an error there? 1 second. Loading. Or do I need to wrap this? Shouldn't. No. Sorry about this. I'm gonna pop that back up there. It's not gonna look as nice and clean, but it's gonna work. And then we're just gonna say div name and display the name. What's missing from this? Can anyone tell me what's missing from this this little bit of code here? It's important when we iterate over an array. Yeah, our key. We need a key, right? We're going to get told you need a key. Oh, that's why we're messed up in here. We need to wrap this. Okay, we need a key in here. And we're going to say name because they're unique. Only do something unique in there. Okay, so we started off with this loading phase, right? We're in loading right now. Names is empty. We do not have anything in there. So what we want to do is after this is set, we want to go and get some data and bring it back and put it into our set state. Okay, so this is very, very common way to build applications. Before we do that with componented mount, I kind of want to talk about what we're doing with this, right? Componented mount is going to be invoked after the render is called, and it's really used to get asynchronous data back into our application. And this is data that might take a long time to get. So we haven't gone over servers or outside APIs, and we're going to go over that after the break. But essentially what happens is here's your computer, right? Or you have a laptop. Boop. You have a database over here, offsite, right? And then you have some servers. Boop, 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 boop. Those servers, that's what sound servers make. Okay, so your React app is loading into this screen. React. And it loads up. And now it needs to go and get some data. So what it needs to do is it needs to go and ask this server that's offsite. This is the internet here. All right. And the server is going to say, oh, yeah, I know where that is. It's in this database. And the database is going to be like, oh, let me go find that for you. Then I'm going to give it back to the server. And the server is going to be like, oh, here it is. And all of this takes time. Okay. It could be a millisecond. It could be 10 seconds. Depends on how much data you get. It depends on how far the servers are physically away from you. Depends on how far the database is physically away from the server. But no matter what, this is always going to take at least some time. This is not instantaneous. And if we try to load all this stuff up in our render phase right here, this is going to stop our app from rendering. Right? We are not going to render anything to the screen until it has finished computing the data it needs, right? And so it's going to pause our app from rendering, and it's going to wait. And then once it gets the data, then it's going to do its thing, and then it's going to render to the screen. So to combat that, we are not going to put any kind of asynchronous server fetches or anything like that into our render. We're going to have a very basic UI to render, get something on the screen. This is all about user experience. We're going to get something on the screen. We're going to display something. And then once that's displayed, we can go and do this part of it, okay? And that's where component did mount comes into play. So this is known as asynchronous data loading or data fetching. And we don't want to back anything up or pause anything, I should say, not back anything up, pause anything. Let's actually just clear that. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a component did mount. All right, component did mount, as we remember, is built into React. React knows to call this. Okay, so it has to be named this. It has to be cased exactly like this, and it knows to call this. Inside of here, we can now say this dot set state, and I'll say names. What did I call that up there? Names. Oh, why is it not appearing for us? And render. Oh, that's why. Cool. So and now we have our names appear on the screen. So let's pretend don't worry about exactly what this is. If you haven't used it before, this is just going to mimic something that takes a little bit of time, and let's say 2 seconds. So now we have this loading, and now our data is fetched. Okay, so this is going to mimic a 2-second delay, and let's delay it a little bit longer. So say our component mounts, and we get that loading screen, and then component did mount and goes and says, oh, I need this data. So it's going to boop, getting the data, and now we've gotten it. Okay, so that's why we use component did mount, is to go and fetch data after we have rendered something to the screen. It's a really fantastic piece of this lifecycle for doing that. So any questions on this right now? I want to see where our questions are. Also, don't worry about set timeout. You're not going to have to write this. There is no max length to the key. Nope. Key can be as long as you want. You don't want it to be like 3 gigabytes of string long, because that is just awful for your app, but there's no max length. I'm not sure how we'd view the keys in React DevTools. Hopping over to Paul, we can give some users something to look at. Yeah, the user needs feedback. How many times have you gone to a website and clicked a button and it sat there? And you're like, is it working? Is it doing anything? Is it broken? Is it actually, do I need to click it again? This is like really, really huge in the UI UX world. It's that user feedback. It's telling the user, hey, I got it. We're going to go do something. Wait here for a second. The loading circle, preloader animations, it's all this stuff, right? It's telling the user, we understand you're going to wait for a second. Here's something to look at to let you know that we're actually doing something. This isn't broken. Okay. When you load Slack up, you'll load a page or a channel, and you'll see a little spinner. You're like, oh, it's a white spot page. And then you see a little spinner. You're like, oh, okay, cool, it's working. If you just saw a white page, you'd be like, this is broken. I need to restart it. I need to refresh the page. I need to click that button again. That's essentially what we're doing with this. And we're not locking our entire application up with component or with including this in render. Okay. Just remember, render gets called as many times as it needs to. Also, we can't set the state in render. So where would we, if we weren't to do this, where would we put this set state at? If we had this, like, say this was a You may not know what this means yet, but this is a fake API fetch call. Where would we put this if we didn't have component did mount? Couldn't do it in render, right? Because we have set state. Yeah, we'd have to put it in the constructor, right? I'm going to try it. Let's see what happens. And we're not actually going to set state because it doesn't know what this set state is. What we're going to do is we're going to put this in there, that state. Okay. So now it doesn't even know. This is a tough one, right? Thankfully, we have component did mount to be able to do this for us. And that's specifically what this is built for. Cool. Any other questions right now? All right. I'm going to give you a little project. I would like you to go through here, play around with the constructor, with render, console log, see what's getting called when. I would also like you to put a component did mount in here. There is a list of people as an array, and actually I'll just put it in here for you. Import people from people. And I want you to render this list of people, just the names. That's all you need to do. You can do whatever you want, but I just want you to be able to get this list of people to render to the screen after the component has been rendered for the first time. Okay? So I'll give you 10 minutes to work on this. Play around with it, throw some console logs in there, see what's getting called when, and try to get that list of people rendered to the screen. There's a link for it. Make sure you fork it. And where's my 10-minute? Let's go 10-minute timer on here. We'll do 10 minutes. All right. See you all in 10 minutes. Have fun. All right, everybody, come on back and we will keep going. I hope you gain a little insight, a little experience of working with that. We are going to, I forgot to show you the React component documentation. So this is pretty awesome stuff. If you go to the React component docs, which I'll share with you, you're going to scroll down a little bit and you're going to come to the component lifecycle, right? So this is going to be documentation for all of these things. You can click on, we have the mounting, updating, and unmounting. There's also some error handling stuff. And you're going to notice there's a bunch of these different methods. There's state derived safe and props. There's, they took out all, there's the component will mount used to be one. There used to be a component will update, component will receive props. These are old deprecated lifecycle methods. But the ones who are really most important, the ones we're most concerned with are the bold ones, right? Constructor, render, component did mount, render, once again, component did update. So this is actually going to allow us, this is going to be called once per update and allow us to do something, figure something out. So that being said, would component did update, would that be a good place to set state? Just knowing what you know from that one little sentence I said there. Would it be a good place to set state, yes or no? We've got a maybe. Yes. We've got 3 yeses, a maybe, and a no. What does everyone else think? Yes, yes, yes. All right. So we haven't talked about it, but this updating, all of these in updating, how many times is render going to be called in updating? It's going to be called once every update, right? So it's an awful place to set state. In fact, if we set it, it's going to create this infinite loop. Component did update gets called every time every time the component is updated. So that's going to be called as many times as render is per update, right? The only time it's not called is on the mount. So this is not going to be a good place to set state. We need to figure out another place if we're going to try to set it per update, okay? Because it's going to be called, and then if we reset the state, render is going to be called, the component's going to be updated, and then component did update is going to be called again. So just think about it, think it through, and there's a great little, here it is right here, and some of these lifecycle methods have been deprecated. So will update is deprecated, will unmount and will mount have all been deprecated, and will receive props. So the wills have been deprecated. But we see should update, render, did mount. There's now a did update right there. So the first thing that happens in constructor isn't on here either. It should be right here. Should be constructor, render, did mount, and then it goes will update, render, did update, will update, render, did update, and that keeps going around in a circle. So did update's going to still be called until will unmount is called, and then it's over. Okay, so there's a link to this article in Training Kit. It is a good article, but some of the stuff is a little outdated in here. Will receive props no longer exists. So just kind of skim through it and kind of see. I really like this graphic though. I think we should make an updated graphic of this to kind of show you that the circle of the component life cycle. Okay. So really think about it when you're where the method lives. So if it lives in this updating part, you probably shouldn't set state on it. The mounting component did mount is the place to do that. So the docs in here, and you can actually click on it. You can get a better understanding. Let's see, we kind of have the old style. way of binding on our constructor here. It'll tell you a lot about what the method actually does. So there's did mount. You may call set state immediately in component did mount. It's what it's built for. Okay. The docs are a fantastic place to read up on this, and I think the React docs are some of the best documentation that I've seen. So enjoy them while you can, because you're about to head into the land of not the best docs when we get to the back end stuff. Cool. So I gave you this friends and wanted you to essentially just play around with the different methods. I'm actually going to play around with something else completely. Actually, let's see. 1 second. Thought I had this all set up. Let me go into here. This is not completed yet. Yeah, it is completed. Okay, never mind. Let's go do friends. Friends is better. It's definitely not completed. Okay, so let's just take a look at this very simple component. We're just going to work in app now and not create any more components out of it. All right. So what we're going to do is we are going to first get our constructor going. If you are not using state, and if you're not using any kind of binding, a lot of times you don't need a constructor. Okay, it automatically explicitly does that. For this class, I want you to always put a constructor in your class component from the get-go. Like I've said in a previous lesson, if you understand completely how it works and you understand why you can leave it off sometimes, go for it. But until that point, keep it on. And in this case, I'm going to say we are using state in here. So I'm going to go this.state equals, and I'm going to do our friends. Or, yeah, it's still friends. And I'm going to give that an empty array. Okay. Also in here, I'm going to, after super, because it'll get mad at me. And constructor. All right. So we have this constructor that's going to set some state. Remember, this is our initial setup. This is our build-up. This is the birth of our component here. Everything is now set. This is the everything for a component. Once constructor is called, our component is built, and it runs from there as it would. So we need to set up the data that we need initially. We want some state. We want a key on that state called friends. We know it's going to be an array. This is why we set this up, okay? Then I'm going to come down here, and I'm going to just do a div. Maybe I'll make this a UL. And then we're going to say if this.state.friends.length equals 0. What if I didn't have friends on here? What would happen? Just running this. Anyone have any idea? If I didn't even have friends on state, if I don't look at the error. It's going to error. Why is it going to error? Because it's going to say, I don't know what the length is of something that doesn't exist, right? So that's oftentimes, especially when it comes to arrays and objects, why we will just include an empty array in here. So we can do something like this. If the length is 0, we could do if this.state.friends equals undefined, but we're just going to do it this way right now. So we'll say H1 loading. You might be like, well, what if you tried to load the friends and you didn't have any friends? That would be a great use case for figuring another piece of state out. but we're just going to go with, if we don't have friends, it means we're loading right now. Otherwise, what we're going to do is we are going to this.state.friends.map. Oh, we don't even have to do that. We're already in there. And we are going to say friend and we're going to return an li. Make sure we put a key on there. And I know our friends have an ID on them. Yes. So they do have an ID on them. And then we'll just put, I believe it's first name or name. First name. Let's put first name on here for right now. All right, let's take a look at what we've got. We've got a loading screen now. Okay. So this is what happens. And let's go render. We're going to console log it in here as well. All right, so we've loaded our app up. We see that our constructor was called, and then render was called. And since our constructor set our state, set our initial data with an empty array, our render is going to render an H1 that says loading, okay? And essentially that's what we have here, right? So once this has been rendered to the screen, let's do a component did mount. And in here, we can set the state now. And I do want to, I like the set timeout to really mimic what it looks like. You actually go and fetch data. We're going to set the state and we're going to say friends is people. Friends is people. So there we go. So let's look at it. Look at that. I want to run that again. Let's watch our console here. Oh, why aren't our names appearing? That's bugging me now. Oh, it's first underscore name for the actual friend. Thank you. Cool. So let's come in here and let's come and look at what's happening. All right. Our constructor is being called. That's the first thing. That's our setup. That's the birth of this component right here. Then render is being called. That's the next thing on the life cycle. Render is going to be called. It's going to render some UI based on the data it currently has. Once render is called, then component did mount is called. And if we look at this, component did mount is called, and then it waits. Okay, we're getting some stuff. And once set state is called, there, render is then called again. It's updated. Okay, at this point, we are now in our updating phase of our life cycle in render. All right, so we have the constructor, we have render, and we have component did mount. Those all get called once. Then when our life cycle is updated, we go into the update phase, and in render will get called. And we could, I think we're going to go into it a little bit in the next lesson. Component did update. All right, we'll see constructor, render, component did mount. in render, and then after in render, component did update. So if we had something that was like a set interval that came in here and changed our timeout, or it changed every so often, our update, this is our update phase right here and now. We're going to talk about the update stuff and the unmounting a bit in the next lesson, but that's essentially what we have for our lifecycle methods right now. We're focusing on the first three in this. Does anyone have any questions about this right now, or is everything clear to you all? And if you have questions, please, 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 I would love to hear them. It's the last time you'll get to ask questions until the new year. So, all right, no questions. I'll give another minute. This has been a fairly short lecture tonight. Wanted to make sure that we understood these concepts. I'm not sure I know what that is, Paul. Oh, after hours. Well, you can always pop in. People will be hanging around, I'm sure, if you have any questions, but nothing official. So life cycle method is a method that is called, well, Jason, I don't know if I would phrase it that way. On when it should render, no, it's render is only one piece of the component, right? So saying when it should render is a little misleading. I'd say when the component changes, maybe that's not even the right word. Changes is only for unmount and update. Lifecycle methods happen at very precise times in the component's life. I'll say that. That was kind of a roundabout way of saying life cycle, right? So, there's just very specific times when methods are called, and these methods are all defined by React, and there's just very specific times when they're called. They could be triggered by an update to the data. They could be triggered by an update to the UI. They could be triggered by a creation of the component or the destruction of the component. It's just a very specific time. Ashley asked a great question. What is this line right here? So let's break this line down, this LI line. So in this case, we are writing JSX, right? We have a list item. We have a key. We are using the squiggly brackets because we're in JSX, and the curvy brackets indicate that we are writing JavaScript, actual JavaScript in it. So friend.id is actual JavaScript, not part of the JSX. And what that's going to do is that's going to be populated by the friend and the ID of the friend right there, right? Each friend has an ID. So this is just denoting that we're actually writing real JavaScript in there. So that's our key. In here, same thing. We need to, if we did this, if we had no curly brackets, you're going to see literally friend.firstname appear right here. See? We need to denote that this is JavaScript and this is not the actual text we want it to be displayed. So we put the curly brackets in there. Cool. You can come into here and see my completed code if you'd like. Yeah. Any other questions? All right, we have an hour and 26 minutes left in the class tonight. I would love for you to come into Training Kit, scroll all the way to the bottom, near the bottom, and you're going to have a challenge down here. Okay, you are going to need to create your own React component. You can use Code Sandbox. You can use Create React App. You can do whatever you want. There's nothing to, I would say use codesandbox.io because it'll get you up to speed real fast. And then we want you to create a component that takes a list and displays it. And you use this, you just copy paste this method into your component did mount and use it. Okay, this is going to give you a list of dogs, and you can go and console log your state after it gets that list to see how it's formatted. There is a kind of a bonus right here. If you get stuck, this is what we're going for. This is a completed, but I'd like you to work on this for the next 25 minutes of the class. After this, even if you get stuck, go ahead and look into the code we've written. After that, then I would like you to go into your project and start working on the project for this week. No, we're not, Jason, we're not getting into the promises. You're going to copy paste this. I know that most of you don't know what any of this means. That's totally fine. You will be learning it. Copy paste it, okay? And we'll be learning it, what all this means in 2 instructional weeks. So we will understand what this means in a couple of weeks after the new year. But just copy paste it into your component did mount, use it, and then see what happens and see what you get. Spend the next 25 minutes working on it. Other than that, everybody, I hope you enjoy the holiday break. I hope you have a great new year. If those of you that can make it, I hope to see you in the hackathon. Those that can't, just keep on working and doing your thing, and we'll see you in the new year. And we'll get right back into React. And yeah, that's it. Have a great night, everyone. Enjoy the break, and I'll see you in 2019. Remember, work on this little project for the next until 8 p.m. Pacific, and then go work on your main project. Have a good night. We'll see you later.